My name is Benjamin Law. I'm a Queenslander originally, don't hold that against me. I'm a freelance writer, and my main kind of bread and butter writing has been for magazines over the years, magazines like Frankie magazine, the Monthly magazine, which is a society and politics culture magazine that comes out on a monthly basis, very imaginatively titled, yes, and also Good Weekend magazine, which comes out every weekend with the Sydney Morning Herald, where I have a weekly column. Often I tell my story because the way in which I write is in two modes. Either I'm telling stories about other people in my journalism, or I'm telling stories about myself and my life in my memoirs or in my TV screenwriting or in my columns. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background in terms of who I am. So my story actually kind of begins before I was born, like all of our stories do. I'm going to take you back to Hong Kong in the 1970s when my parents were getting married. And I like this photo because they still like each other. It's hilarious. They have no idea what's coming up. And what I really love about this photo is also that when I think of my mum's headspace at this time, so she's just met this guy, they've only known each other for a few months, they're madly in love, and they are getting married, and they're going to move to a country where he has been to once, and she has never been to before in her life. That country is, of course, Australia. They move to coastal Queensland in a very... well, it's what my mum described as a ghost town for two reasons. One, there were very few people, and the ones who were there were all white. Why two people who grew up around no water and cannot swim moved to coastal Queensland is still a mystery to me. And look, the other thing that I like bringing up about this photo as well is when I was growing up, I always used to think of my parents' story as very much my family story, but then I realised their story is kind of an Australian story as well. So, you know, put up your hand if, like my parents, you speak languages other than English at home. Yeah, that's quite a few hands. That's because you guys are part of the 1 in 5 Australians who speak languages other than English at home. Put up your hand if you were born overseas. Yeah, a lot of hands. That's because you were part of the 1 in 4 Australians who were born overseas. Put up your hand if you have at least one parent who was born overseas. Yep, if you're Australian, you're a part of the 1 in 2 Australians with at least one parent born overseas. And for those of you who didn't put up your hand, don't worry, you're also very special. And we love you just as much. But for those of you who didn't put up your hand and you are Australian and you're non-Indigenous, you wouldn't have to go far back into your family tree to find out where you know, that part of the family tree branches out from Australia. We're one of the most diverse nations in the world. After that photo was taken, this photo was taken, like basically the next day, because my parents did what migrants to this country do so well, which is breed. A lot. They were not religious, they were just very enthusiastic. And of course, when you kind of grow up in a particularly white part of Australia, when the media representations of Australia are also quite white at that stage, I mean, and arguably still now, you always grow up with this kind of, miasma of identity issues going on, like, who am I? It's like that Zoolander scene where he stares at a puddle. Who am I? Am I really Chinese? Am I really Australian? It didn't occur to me back then, and I still think it doesn't occur to a lot of Australians that you can be both at the same time as well. We didn't really speak Cantonese very well, so there were language issues. And of course, another thing that was going on, which you are able to probably tell by this photo, is that, yes, young Benjamin was a homosexual as well. And so you've got layer upon layer of identity issues. It's like a turducken of minorities in one. And for those of you in the room who identify, you'll go back to your childhood photos often, and we all find evidence that it's there from the start. Yeah. And if you want to find more photos like that, there is a whole Tumblr dedicated to them called bornthiswayblog.tumblr.com. I recently posted this photo on Instagram that my boyfriend was like taken aback with, and it was me as a kid holding a bunch of flowers, and the caption was, "This boy has flowers to deliver and boys to kiss." And my boyfriend's just like, "Yeah, but you were just a child." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's fine as well, wanted to kiss boys, leave me alone. And so from those stories, growing up gay, growing up Asian, Australian as well, having parents who would eventually divorce when I was at quite a young age, I would start writing stories, and years later, I would start writing a book of those stories called The Family Law, about my family. My last name is Law. It's a very clever play on words. I'm not sure if you understand it. This was supposed to represent me at around the age of 12, when I was starting to realize, become cognizant of the fact that I was gay, the fact that my parents are breaking up around me as well, that age where you start feeling embarrassed by your family who can't be identified, even though I use totally their real names in the book. But I think we moved on from that cover after they sold out of this one, because it looked like maybe it was a memoir about abuse or something. So this was the next cover. A lot of people couldn't tell that was a Chinese firecracker. They just saw explosives. So it went from abuse memoir to terrorism memoir. The French edition didn't even have a family, so suddenly it was an orphan memoir. And then this was maybe a medical memoir where I retained too much water in my skull or something. And then the final and current iteration of the book is this, where we do have a family on the cover, and they are not my real family, but they are the actors who play a version of my family on the SBS adaptation of the show, which you can still watch now on SBS On Demand for free. 2 series of it, and maybe there'll be a third, I don't know. As I said, I write in 2 modes, and the other mode in which I write is about other people. That's within my journalism as well. So after I wrote The Family Law, I wanted to, after you write a memoir, you feel like a little bit gross. You've been writing about yourself for so long. I really wanted to write about other people. The other thing that I had in the back of my mind, and I guess anyone from a migrant background would have when you're growing up, is the what if question. Like, what if my parents had never moved to Australia? What would my life as an openly gay person, at least in Australia, be like if I'd grown up in China, where my dad was born, if I'd grown up in Malaysia, where my mum was born, arguably more conservative countries in their own way. But China's such an interesting country because a lot of people there would say that homophobia doesn't exist as we know it in Australia. It's more of the invisibilization of the gay community. How does that manifest as well? And so I had all of those questions coming in, and I started traveling through Asia over 2.5 years to write a book about queers in Asia, gays in Asia. Of course it was going to be called Gaysia. Again, another clever play on words. I'm not sure if you understand it. And over that period, I would travel through Indonesia and Thailand, China, Japan, Malaysia, Myanmar, also known as Burma, and finally in India, where I got terrible food poisoning, and you can read all about it during the Mumbai Pride March, the last place you want to have a gastrointestinal issue. One of the things that people often ask me as a writer is why I write, and they also ask, do you really go out of your way to write about Asianness or gayness and being a minority? And I think all of us who come from a minority background, whether we're queer or a racial minority, we know that we can't disentangle those things from ourselves. I mean, when I write a column for Good Weekend, sometimes I get people say to me, "You've written a lot about gay stuff lately," and then I get really self-conscious and I'm like, have I been pushing the gay agenda over the last few weeks? And then I look back and I realize I haven't written anything explicitly gay for that column. Not that I write about, anal or anything, but I haven't written anything explicitly gay for that column, except last week I mentioned my boyfriend in passing. Just as much as heterosexual columnists might talk about their opposite sex spouse in passing, but no one says to them, you are advancing a heterosexual agenda. The idea that just because you are not seen as neutral means that you are obviously approaching things from another side, I think is kind of problematic. One of the reasons why I think I write is expressed by the Dominican-American writer Junot Diaz. When I was growing up, keep in mind that I grew up in coastal Queensland. It was largely pre-internet, so as I was graduating high school, dial-up modems were starting. Some of you were looking at me like, how old are you? Asian skin, it ages very, very well. But because of that, my only access to the outside world was through traditional media, and my view of the rest of Australia was one that was, very Anglo, very white, and very straight as well. I did not see myself reflected back at me in my stories. And Junot Diaz has this great quote where he says, there's this idea that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. What I've always thought isn't that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. It's that if you want to make a human being into a monster, you deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. Growing up, I felt like a monster in some ways. I didn't see myself reflected at all. And I think for any of us who've felt like that person in the room where we're like the only one that is different, we can probably relate to that as well. I won't take up too much of your time, but I'm just going to finish off with, because I like you guys, a preview of the next thing that I've been working on for the last half a year, actually. Originally, I was going to write a third book, and it was going to be about sex education in Australia. That conversation has changed sharply in the last couple of years, and it's become very much a conversation about safe schools. Safe Schools, as a lot of you might know, was a program that originated in Victoria as the Safe Schools Coalition Victoria in 2010. It was launched by the Tony Abbott government. I cannot say that enough because the narrative about this has been very, very skewed. It was launched by the Tony Abbott government to become a federal program. Years later, it had the support of the Federal Education, Department of Education and Training there. And then it became a moral panic as of 2016 in February when The Australian made it front page news. I've written a quarterly essay about this that will come out on September 11. Very auspicious date. But then again, Safe Schools Coalition Australia was launched on Friday the 13th as well. So we have a habit of hitting dates that are quite grim. I'm just going to read you an extract from it, and the extract is going to be the conclusion. And hopefully, I mean, we are having this conversation on the first day after enrolment's closed for the same-sex marriage postal survey. Please refer to it that. It's not technically a plebiscite. It's a strange thing that Australia has not done before as well. Gymnastic contortions that have led us here. And I just want to kind of summarise what has happened with Safe Schools and how that leads us into the postal survey conversation as well. As I write this, the Coalition has failed, again, to push a non-binding plebiscite on marriage equality through the Senate. In a move that has infuriated queer activists and baffled constitutional lawyers, the Coalition performed a strange feat of political gymnastics that is likely to see the Commonwealth spend $122 million so the Australian Bureau of Statistics can conduct a voluntary opinion poll on same-sex marriage through the post. Whether efforts to stop the postal survey in the High Court are successful or not, we now know why the Coalition has forced this upon us to accommodate those who think same-sex romantic partnerships are inferior to heterosexual ones. Some can't even process the concept. On Sky News, a hapless Kevin Andrews likened same-sex relationships to the friendships he shared with his cycling buddies. I have an affectionate relationship with my cycling mates. We go cycling on the weekend. But that's not marriage, he said. Managing editor of Junkie, Rob Stott, cleared things up on Twitter. Kevin Andrews thinks committed gay couples are just like good friends. Kevin, I have news for you. We fuck. Keep in mind that this is also marriage that queers are asking for, the most arguably conservative and heteronormative of institutions. So if leaders can't get their heads around that idea, is it any wonder they struggle to understand that young people might be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and non-binary? By contrast, school principals across Australia have examined the evidence, faced pressure and abuse over safe schools and held their nerve. As Shalila Medora for The Guardian reported, when Simon Birmingham, the Education Minister, announced the review for safe schools at the height of the scandal in late February 2016, 495 schools were signed up to safe schools. A couple of weeks later, remember this is the height of the scandal, the number was 526. Principals refused to bow to moral panic. Parents are spooked though. lies abound. In late July this year, an unnamed Victorian woman posted a video on Facebook claiming her 13-year-old son had been asked to make a model vagina at school, that his best friend was taught how to use a dildo, that her daughter's class were taught masturbation techniques, and there were 63 different genders. These activities, she claimed, were part of the Safe Schools pack provided to the school. No such packs exist. And yet, with the help of the Australian Marriage Alliance, the video has gone viral, scoring over 4 million views and more than 62,000 shares. And in early August, Rowan Dean, in an opinion piece for the Courier Mail, used the video as an example of what was wrong with Safe Schools, mentioning the Department of Education and Training had denied the claims, but essentially taking the mother at her word. And in August, The Age reported that the mother in the video was Marique Rancy, a born-again Mormon and Liberal Party member. Rancy is a part of a Liberal Party cohort that regards whipping up fear over Safe Schools as, quote, a good recruitment tool, and has distributed flyers claiming the program educates children by teaching them how to act like homosexuals and bisexuals. It'd make for an interesting classroom. For those of us who feel that change is too fast and too confronting, it's worth asking ourselves what we're afraid of. Where is this epidemic of transgender children undergoing unnecessary hormone or surgery treatments? And how would a minor manipulate the family courts into allowing surgeons, psychiatrists, and endocrinologists to perform needless medical tasks on them? Where are the reckless medical professionals apparently willing to do it? And if we're genuinely concerned that alerting children to the mere existence of same-sex attracted and gender-diverse people will compel them to question their gender and sexuality, should we not also be worried by current VCE-mandated texts about infanticide, like Medea, murder, burial rights, the white tiger, and genocide, the complete mouse? And for all of our anxieties about correct toilet usage, where are the documented cases of people pretending to be transgender to use women's bathrooms to spy on them? When was the last time you saw another woman's genitals in the toilet anyway? People have become so frightened of phantom hypotheticals lately that we're asking the strangest questions with no bearing on reality. And this has paralysed and distracted us from asking the simplest and most important question of young people and children amongst us, which is, what do you need of us and how can we help? I think that's a good place to leave it on We're at Purple Day. This day in particular is about young people in our community. For those of you who have reservations about the postal survey, I share them. I resent that we are having to go through this it's $122 million. I'm still staggered by that. That is far more expensive than the Safe Schools program, by the way. And for those of you who do have reservations, I would say, don't vote yes for yourself as an adult. You know that this political process is bullshit. Vote for the young people in your life. Vote for the young LGBTIQ people who don't know the nuances of the political debate, who don't know that this is an unfair, rigged fight. Vote for the straight kids in your life. Think about the message you want to send them after this vote's done, who also don't know the nuances. They don't know this is a rigged and unfair fight. They'll just see that Australians either support or don't support same-sex marriage. Let's make this work and let's get to work. Thank you very much.